Every time you come up with a solution, you create a problem. So the latest problem in this steering project is this piece in the bottom of the box. Now normally this tube runs up through the hollow shaft, and it's long enough that it actually is up inside the column outside the box. And the reason for that is that tube allows the horn wire to come all the way down and out the bottom of the steering box, and the tube is long enough to keep the oil from getting in the tube and running out the bottom of the box. So that normally is just tapped in there in the bottom of the box. So because we have a solid shaft now, we can't have this in there, so we got to tap that out. Now we got a big hole, and the oil's going to run out of there big time. So what we're going to have to do is get a freeze plug that's the same size as that lip there, and put a solid freeze plug in there and plug up the hole. Now it's pretty hard to take this original one out without killing it, so there's really nothing to do with that. You can't really cut the tube off. I suppose a guy might try to fill that hole with JB weld or something, but you're just kidding yourself. The best thing to do is knock it out of there, and then you've got to get a plug. They even make some rubber plugs. You could probably fit one of them in there, but I would just get a freeze plug, expansion plug, one of those dome types, and set it in there and whack it. Should seal that up. You could put some RTV around it. There's no pressure on it, but you don't want the oil to leak out the bottom of the steering box. So that's just one more thing that you got to resolve by putting a solid shaft in there, but it's not really that big a deal. This is the repair that we did, or the patch, whatever you want to call it, bottom of the steering box. If you remember, this flat plate and tube were originally in that hole. We had to eliminate that because we no longer have a hollow steering shaft. So we got an 1 3/16 concave freeze plug. Set it in there. It was a little sloppy, not a real snug fit. We put some RTV in and laid it in there, whacked it in the center with a hammer, and then put a little swirl of RTV around the outside. Seems to have sealed the thing up perfectly. Maybe you can see in there, there's a puddle of water right there. That's because we plugged up that hole in the bottom where the tube was and filled it with water to see if it would leak. That's our test. After 2 days, water's still there. We finally got our parts order in. So we got a new worm gear. We took our solid shaft, machined a key slot in it, and then a slight taper on the end to match the inside of the gear. Heated this gear and pressed the gear onto the shaft. So now we have our complete new lower shaft, solid, with a double D on this end, coupled to our Saturn View output. And that will allow us to put the whole thing together. See the double D there? We'll go ahead and put our housing on, our bushing in, and that's going to give us our whole lower unit. This will bolt to the steering box, and then we have this tube that just goes on here. Got a hole cut in it so we can tighten up the set screw there once we get everything together, and that will be the whole sort of whole lower unit of this piece. And really, it should now be functional. I mean, right now it's fairly easy to turn. It's just sort of normal mechanical steering with no assist. Once we get it all hooked up, it'll have some power assist. Here you can see we've put basically the whole thing together. You have the worm gear that goes down in the steering box. This flange bolts to the top of the steering box and puts preload on that bearing. You have your lower tube, adapters. We have over here the Saturn power steering unit, and then on the other side we have the input shaft, bracket that mounts to the dash, and the steering wheel of course goes all the way on the end. We finally got all of our pieces made up for our electric steering column, and here you can see it all assembled. We'll take it apart here so you can see what we've done. Got a grub screw, set screw there, another one over there, and essentially this is the stock upper shoebox steering shaft. We've welded the coupler on there just to smooth, and we've also pinned it and welded it, and then this piece is sort of a custom made piece. You've seen that in the early videos. I'm not sure this will come off of here again, but we'll give it a try. We don't lose our screw there. We can tap it off of there. They're a genuine tapping tool. Maybe get a brass hammer there so we don't damage our super duper piece. Okay, so this piece is kind of a custom made piece. We took the original spline that slid over this, the Saturn piece, and put it inside a smooth coupler. Actually machined a smooth coupler so that it slipped over. Got a set screw that runs all the way through. We've got a piece of double D shaft that we put down in this end. Had a set screw in it, a grub screw. Welded it all the way around, all three pieces essentially, and pinned it. So this converts the existing Saturn input to a double D, which is easy to made up to something else. This input spline is not available anywhere. There's no coupler that you can buy that will slip over this input spline. It's an odd size. That's why we had to make this coupler ourselves. The other side, the output side, you can buy various couplers for that and get where you need to go. So then we'll just slide our double D shaft on there, tighten up our set screws, and now our input shaft is complete. We have the collar assembly, the slip over that, and this is a combination of the original collar from the Saturn and the tube or collar from the Shoebox Ford. These two pieces, one slips over the other. It's not exactly a slip fit. The Shoebox tube is a bit smaller than the Saturn tube, so what we're going to do is we'll slit this Saturn tube and crimp that around down to the right size. Probably put a clamp around that, a band clamp, and that way we'd be able to adjust this and assemble it all later. But that gives us the whole steering column from steering wheel to worm gear, all made up and replicating the length of the original Shoebox steering column. So we've got to assemble this lower half into the steering box and then mount everything in the car, and at the end of the day we should end up with electric power steering. That remains to be seen, and we'll get working on it and see if we can make it happen. The secret here, just in case we missed it, is to get the right gasket pack in there to adjust the preload on the bearing, and a few thousandths one way or the other will really make a big difference. For some reason this thing wants to fight me now all of a sudden. Always the way. And there you go. Just gotta hold your mouth right. So get these pulled down. In this case, we'll just snug it up. We've got some preload on the bearing, but no play. Now you may remember from the previous video that we have this bushing that we made to go in the tube. You keep the column in the center. We'll fit that down in there. And then we have another sleeve that goes on here and aligns this with the power steering unit. So you can see that this turns nice and free. Got a little hop in it there. I'm going to have to figure out where that's coming from. And it may be advisable, this coupling that we're using in this particular application is a solid coupling, double D to a spline. You can get a U-joint to a spline if you want, and it might be a good idea to look into that. If you got a little whoop-eye in the shaft here, the U-joint will accommodate that, although I think this will be alright once everything's bolted together. So the nice thing about this is essentially this is the whole. We have the steering box, even though it's not completely assembled. We have the lower tube and we have the shaft, and at this point you could put this in the car and you can put whatever you want from here back. A regular steering column, you put a rag joint here, you can do whatever you want. I just recommend that you support the other end of the shaft here somehow, whether a bearing plate in the firewall or something, because it's not enough to just have it running on the bearings down there. And then what we can do is we'll just attach our coupler here and our power steering unit under the dash and go up to the steering wheel. So that's where we are at this point. We've got a mock-up chassis out in the yard, so we may assemble this whole steering box and assemble the whole power steering unit and put it on the mock-up chassis just to see how it all works before we get it up into the car. It's a nice sunny day in the backyard, so I thought maybe we could work on our science experiment a little bit more. We've been dragging our feet on this project, this Shoebox electric power steering. We've got a bunch of other projects going on, and this one kind of got put on the back burner, but here you can see we've got the whole thing put together. We've got a mock-up chassis here, just happen to have an extra chassis. So we've got the steering box and the chassis and the linkage hooked up, and the steering column propped up there with a 4x2, and we are going to hook up a battery to it and see if it works. Well, we got the wires hooked up. We're not going to do too much here because we don't really have any way to hold the power steering motor itself from flipping around on us. I'll try to hold it by hand here and see if the wheels, boy, they're sure easy to turn. Look at that, one finger. Wow. Just like downtown. A fair amount of torque on that motor, so that bracket that you make to mount that up under the dash is going to have to be pretty sturdy. The final part of the project is going to be putting this whole system in the car, and that's going to mean that the car is going to be down for the count until we get it done. So might be a bit till we get the final installment done on this project, but we are moving along, so stay tuned and we'll get there eventually.